History is full of incredible stories, but this one is on another level. In just 10 years, one guy, starting from this tiny kingdom of Macedonia, carved out one of the biggest empires the ancient world had ever seen. We're talking about a commander who was brilliant, totally fearless, relentless, and he never lost a single battle. This was the work of one man, who we remember as Alexander the Great. I mean, his name is legendary, right? It's basically shorthand for military genius. But what actually earned him that title? Why is he the Great One? Well, that's what we're gonna figure out. We're gonna dive into his absolutely mind-blowing campaign, get into his really complex personality, and see what kind of mark he left on the world. And right off the bat, you need to know his legacy is complicated. It's not simple at all. Because for the Western world, yeah, he's Alexander the Great. But for the Persians, the people he conquered, they called him Alexander the Accursed. And that contrast right there tells you everything. It's the perfect setup for a story about a man who was seen as both a liberator and a total destroyer. Okay, so to really get Alexander, you have to get the world he stepped into. Picture this. The famous Greek city-states, Athens, Sparta, they were past their prime. They were tired, broken, just worn out from fighting each other for like 100 years. And then you have the big guy on the block, the Persian Empire. Huge, rich, but kind of sick, ailing. The whole world was just waiting. The stage was perfectly set for someone new, someone ambitious to come storming in. But here's something that's absolutely crucial to remember. Alexander didn't just show up out of nowhere. His dad, Philip II, basically did all the prep work. Seriously, he was the one who took those squabbling Greek states and forced them into a league. He's the one who turned the Macedonian army into a full-on professional fighting force. And he introduced this game-changing weapon, the sarissa, an 18-foot-long pike. Philip built the war machine. He even drew up the plans to invade Persia. He set the whole thing up.
And then, just as Philip is about to launch this massive war, he's assassinated. Just like that. And suddenly, his son, a 20-year-old kid named Alexander, is on the throne. And wow, did he move fast. He was absolutely ruthless. He executed any rivals, and when the city of Thebes decided to rebel, he didn't just defeat them, he burned the entire city to the ground. It was a terrifying message to the rest of Greece, and it was crystal clear: don't test me.
So once he's got Greece locked down, Alexander dusts off his dad's old playbook. In 334 BC, he takes his army and marches into Asia to fight the Persian Empire. And you gotta understand the scale of this. It's a tiny kingdom going up against a superpower that stretched across continents. The odds were insane. But this, right here, is where the legend of Alexander the Great really kicks off.
Now, the core of his army, the thing that made it so unstoppable, was this incredible invention, the Macedonian phalanx. Just try to picture this. It's a tight block of soldiers, 16 ranks deep. And the first few rows are all pointing these insane 18-foot pikes forward. It's literally a walking wall of sharp iron spear tips. It was like a human bulldozer, and if you tried to charge it from the front, yeah, good luck. It was basically unbreakable.
But the phalanx itself wasn't the whole story. Alexander's real genius was in how he used it. He had this 3-step battle plan that he used over and over again because, well, it just worked every time. Step 1, the phalanx moves in and fixes the enemy's main force. Basically, it pins them down so they can't go anywhere. Step 2, he'd use other troops to hit the sides, the flanks, forcing the enemy to spread out and create a weak spot, a gap. And then, step 3, the hammer blow. Alexander himself, at the head of his best cavalry, would charge right into that gap. It was devastating. It just shattered enemy armies. And the speed at which he did all this, it's just breathtaking. I mean, look at this timeline. In 334 BC, he wins his first big fight at the Granicus. A year later, he's faced with the legendary Gordian knot. Prophecy says whoever unties it will rule Asia. Alexander doesn't bother with the puzzle. He just pulls out his sword and slices it in half. Classic Alexander. Later that year, at the Battle of Issus, he makes the Persian king himself, Darius III, run for his life. And then, in 331 BC, Gaugamela. This is the big one, the final crushing victory that completely breaks the back of the Persian Empire. But here's the thing about Alexander. Defeating the world's biggest superpower, that wasn't enough. For him, that was just the warm-up. He was completely relentless. He just kept pushing his army forward, past the heart of Persia, and into these wild, unknown lands we now call Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And this is where you really start to see that his ambition had no off switch. It wasn't just about ruling an empire. No, he seemed to genuinely believe that it was his fate, his destiny, to march all the way to the literal edge of the known world.
His skills as a general were really put to the test in India, because there he came up against something new, something absolutely terrifying: war elephants. I mean, can you imagine? The Battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus was his toughest, bloodiest fight for sure. His soldiers were petrified, but Alexander, as always, figured it out. He changed his tactics on the fly and once again pulled off a spectacular victory. But let's just stop and think about his men for a second. Think about what he was asking of them. At this point, they'd been marching and fighting for 8 straight years. 8 years. Thousands and thousands of miles away from home, away from their families. The exhaustion must have been incredible.
And it was right there, at the Hyphasis River in India, that Alexander's unstoppable ambition finally ran into a wall that he could not break. And that wall was his own army. They were done, totally exhausted, hearing stories about even bigger armies waiting for them up ahead. They just stopped. They mutinied. They refused to take one more step. And Alexander, for the first time, was defeated. Not by an enemy, but by his own men. He was absolutely furious, but he had no choice. He had to turn back. You know, this moment really feels like a turning point in the story. All that pressure, the endless fighting, and this growing idea in his own head that he wasn't just a king, but maybe a god, it all started to change him. The inspiring leader began to fade. And what emerged? Well, it started to look a lot more like a cruel, paranoid tyrant. And there's this one horrible story that just perfectly captures this dark turn. Remember Clytus the Black? The guy who literally saved Alexander's life back in his very first big battle? Well, years later, during a drunken argument, Alexander just killed him, murdered him in a fit of rage. Sure, he felt terrible about it afterwards, but it showed that something was really wrong. His paranoia, his violent temper, it was all spiraling out of control. And it wasn't a one-time thing either. He executed one of his most loyal and experienced generals, a guy named Parmenion, just because he suspected him of treason. He started dressing in Persian clothes and adopting their customs, which his Macedonian soldiers saw as totally decadent. And then, the worst part, he demanded that his own men perform proskynesis. That means they had to literally bow down and prostrate themselves before him, like he was a god. To the Greeks, that was just insane. It was blasphemy. He was alienating the very soldiers who'd put him on top of the world. So this all leads us to the final, really big question, right? What happens when this one guy, who's holding this gigantic empire together by sheer force of will, what happens when he's suddenly gone? What's the real legacy of a life like that? He was only 32 years old. 32. He was back in Babylon, already planning his next conquest, this time into Arabia. And then, just like that, he gets a fever, and a few days later, he's dead. His death was just as fast and shocking as his life had been, and he left behind no heir, no successor, no plan for what came next. And you know what? The fallout was immediate. Turns out that whole massive empire was basically held together with one thing: Alexander himself. The second he was gone, it just shattered. His top generals, who became known as the successors, started fighting each other almost immediately, carving up his empire into their own personal kingdoms. It was a complete free-for-all. So if his actual empire fell apart, what's his legacy then? What was the point? Well, it turns out his real legacy wasn't about land or borders. It was about culture. His conquests didn't just break armies. They broke the old world order. They kickstarted what we now call the Hellenistic Age, this amazing new period where Greek culture, Greek language, Greek ideas all mixed and blended with the ancient cultures of Egypt, Persia, and all the way to India. It created a whole new world. Which brings us right back to where we started. He was a visionary general, a ruthless conqueror, a paranoid tyrant, and somehow also the guy who accidentally created a whole new cultural world. So what's the final verdict? Is he Alexander the Great or Alexander the Accursed? Or maybe the answer is more complicated. Maybe he was just human, a person who shows us the absolute highest peaks and the absolute darkest pits of human ambition. And that's a question that, really, history lets us decide for ourselves.